For the first time in history, the United States is spending more money paying interest on its debt than on its entire national defense budget. The debt has now exploded past $36 trillion, a figure so vast it's almost meaningless. But it signals a vulnerability the entire world is starting to exploit. The word de-dollarization is no longer a fringe theory. It's a reality taking shape in capitals from Beijing to Brasilia. For 80 years, the US dollar has been the undisputed king of global finance, an empire built from the ashes of World War II. But now, the throne is shaking. How did we get here? And what happens when the rain ends? Hi everyone, I'm George, a PhD economist, and this video will uncover the incredible story of the dollar's rise to absolute power and expose the forces now gathering to tear it all down, signaling the dawn of a new economic era. Before that though, take a moment and subscribe for weekly financial consulting and macroeconomics updates. 93% of you, my dear viewers, are non-subscribers to this channel, and I know you can find some value from this growing community of curious minds. To understand why the dollar's throne is so precarious, it's crucial to first understand how it was built. And like many kingdoms, it was born from the death of the previous ruler, the British pound sterling. For more than a century, the pound was the bedrock of a global empire so vast the sun never set on it. But two world wars in just 30 years left Britain exhausted and bankrupt, its empire crumbling. The world needed a new anchor and a new leader. America, with its homeland untouched by war and its industrial might roaring, was ready to claim the crown. The dollar's official coronation happened in 1944 in the quiet resort town of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. With an Allied victory in World War II looking certain, delegates from 44 nations came together to design a new economic order. Their goal was to prevent the currency chaos and protectionism that had crippled the world in the 1930s and helped fuel the war. The result was the Bretton Woods Agreement, a landmark deal that made the US dollar the world's main reserve currency. The system itself was beautifully simple. Every other currency would have a fixed exchange rate to the dollar, and the dollar, in turn, was pegged to gold at a rate of $35 an ounce. This meant any central bank holding dollars could, in theory, walk up to the US Treasury and swap them for actual gold. A brilliant move. It made the dollar as good as gold, creating incredible trust and stability. For the first time, the world had a unified monetary system with one reliable currency at its heart. Now, with the rules in place, the next challenge was getting dollars out in the world, because Europe was in ruins. This led to the second pillar of the dollar's rise, the Marshall Plan. Starting in 1948, the United States launched this massive aid program, injecting the equivalent of over $150 billion in today's money into Western Europe. This wasn't just charity. It was a strategic masterstroke. The aid came in dollars and it had to be used to buy goods and materials, mostly from the US. This is what flooded Europe with dollars, kickstarted their economies, and tied their recovery directly to the American currency. The dollar became the essential oil for the engine of post-war global trade. But the system that looked so solid in the 50s started showing cracks by the late 60s. The US was spending a fortune on the Vietnam War and new social programs at home, which meant it was printing more dollars than it could back up with gold. Other countries, especially France, got nervous and started trading their dollars in for gold, draining American votes. By 1971, the US couldn't sustain it, so in a move that floored the global financial system, President Richard Nixon announced that the US would no longer convert dollars to gold. The gold window was slammed shut. This Nixon shock should have been a fatal blow. With the gold link severed, what was the dollar actually worth? Why would any country trust a currency backed by nothing but a promise? The dollar empire could have crumbled right there. Instead, American policymakers engineered one of the most audacious pivots in financial history, creating a brand new foundation for the dollar's power, the petrodollar system. Following the 1973 oil crisis, which sent prices through the roof, the US forged a pact mainly with Saudi Arabia, the world's biggest oil exporter and the unofficial leader of OPEC. The arrangement was simple. Saudi Arabia agreed to price and sell its oil only in US dollars. In exchange, the US offered military protection and weapons. Soon the rest of OPEC followed. This was a complete game changer. Since every country needed oil, every country now needed US dollars to buy it. This created a massive, permanent global demand for the American currency that had nothing to do with gold. It didn't matter what the US economy was doing. As long as the world ran on oil, it would run on dollars. And so, the petrodollar system became the new bedrock of the dollar's dominance for the next 50 years. For years, the euro was presented as the dollar's heir apparent, a currency representing a massive, advanced economic bloc. So, why hasn't it taken the crown? The reasons are threefold, and they expose the deep-seated flaws in the European project. First, despite its economic size, the European industry remains heavily dependent on the American banking system. Major EU companies rely on Wall Street for capital, for investment, and for financial services. This creates a structural reliance where the arteries of European commerce are still rooted through the heart of the American financial empire, giving the dollar a home field advantage that the euro simply cannot match. Second, the European Union has never truly acted as a unified whole. It is a monetary union, but without a true fiscal union. This means that during a crisis, the EU does not help all its member states equally. This was played out brutal during its debt crisis. This inequality creates fractures and resentments, preventing the euro from being backed by the full, unified faith of a single economic power, in the way the dollar is backed by the United States. And finally, the EU made a series of catastrophic mistakes during its sovereign debt crisis. Instead of promoting fiscal resilience for the countries that were hit the hardest, leaders chose to protect the banks. They imposed ridiculous austerity measures on economies already in deep trouble, leading to a collapse in productivity and long-term economic scoring. The European Central Bank's response was extremely late, only implementing quantitative easing long after the damage was done. When it finally acted, it never truly engaged in a tapering process before the COVID crisis hit, leading to a prolonged period of easy money that pumped up asset bubbles instead of promoting real value-adding investments. These actions damaged the credibility of the euro as a stable alternative for the entire world to see. The story of the dollar is really the story of our modern world, and understanding these changes is more important than ever. If this breakdown is proving valuable, take a second to subscribe and hit the notifications bell. I break down the complex economic and geopolitical forces shaping your world every week, and your support makes this content possible. Now, let's turn to the internal threats that are awakening the dollar from within. For decades, the system granted the United States what a French finance minister famously called an exorbitant privilege. America could print money to buy whatever it wanted, run massive trade deficits without consequences, and borrow at rock-bottom rates. It was the ultimate economic superpower, but no empire lasts forever, and the pillars supporting the dollar began to crack. And these aren't minor fissures. They are seismic shocks threatening the entire structure. The first and most obvious is the mountain of debt. The United States government is now over $36 trillion in debt, a number that is difficult to comprehend. As of mid-2025, the US national debt stood at a staggering $36.59 trillion. This has exploded in recent years thanks to huge spending packages, tax cuts, and economic crises. For a long time, the world's hunger for safe US Treasury bonds, which is lending money to the US government, actually helped keep the dollar strong. But a tipping point may be approaching. The Congressional Budget Office projects the debt could hit an astonishing $54 trillion within the next decade. Even more alarming is that the interest payments on the debt have skyrocketed. In 2024, for the first time ever, the US government spent more paying interest on its debt than it did on national defense. This forces the world's investors to ask a terrifyingly simple question. Is this sustainable? A country endlessly printing money to pay the interest on its debt is a classic warning sign, one that can undermine long-term confidence in a currency. The second major crack is the weaponization of dollar. Because the dollar is the plumbing of the global financial system, the US has the unique power to turn the taps on and off. Through sanctions, the US can cut entire countries off the world economy. The main tool for this is SWIFT, the messaging network that handles most international payments. While it's officially based in Belgium, it operates within the US-led financial world. When the US cut major Russian banks out of SWIFT after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, it was like setting off a financial nuclear bomb. While this was meant to punish an adversary, it had a huge unintended consequence. By turning the world's currency into a weapon, America may have won a battle against Russia, but it sent a chilling message to everyone else. You could be next. This fear, more than anything else, is fueling the global race to find an alternative. Nations everywhere, including allies, wasn't realize that their own economic lifelines depend on the political mood of Washington. The search for alternatives is happening while the US is dealing with deep and bitter political polarization at home. A reserve currency is supposed to be a safe harbor in a storm. But what happens when the storm is inside the harbor? Continuous elections, constant threats of government shutdowns over the debt ceiling, and wild policy swings from one administration to the next all weaken the idea that the US is a predictable manager of the global economy. A country's currency is a mirror of its stability. When the world looks at America and sees chaos, that erodes the single most important ingredient for a reserve currency: trust. Investors and central banks need predictability, and right now America's political scene is anything but predictable. The story of the US dollar is a story of incredible success. It rose from the wreckage of a world war to become the lifeblood of the global economy, giving the United States power and influence like no other nation has ever had. For 80 years, the world ran on dollars, but that era is now coming to a close. The pillars of the dollar empire, the gold standard, the petrodollar system, and the image of American stability have either crumbled or are under serious pressure. The nation's staggering debt calls its long-term solvency into question. Its use as a financial weapon has backfired spectacularly, accelerating the very exodus it was meant to prevent. And deep political divides at home have shaken the world's faith in America's leadership. While the dollar's dominance is being challenged, no single currency seems ready to replace it. The euro, once seen as the main contender, has been hobbled by its own structural flaws and policy mistakes, proving to be a giant with feet of clay. In the end, the dollar's last best defense seems to be the lack of a clear and credible alternative. So, what we are likely to witness is not a sudden collapse, but a slow, grinding erosion of power. The unipolar moment for the dollar is over. We are entering a messier and more fragmented financial world. The dollar may remain first among equals for years to come, but its days as the undisputed king are numbered. The real question isn't what will replace the dollar, but how the world will handle the turbulence as its long and historic reign finally ends. So, what do you think this new era will look like? Let me know in the comments below. See you all in the next week for a Consulting Tuesdays video on developing your contingency strategy and an Economic Thursdays video on the rise of BRICS. Bye bye.